There is a sound, the old Greeks believed, beneath all other sounds, beneath the clash of bronze on bronze at Troy, beneath the laughter in the symposium halls of Athens, beneath even the breath of Zeus as he hurled his thunder across the heavens. There was a quieter sound, a whisper, the sound of thread sliding through fingers, the soft click of a spindle turning, the faint final snip of bronze shears closing on a single strand. This was the sound of the Moirai, the Fates. Tonight, we settle in beside that sound. We let the great battles fade, let the gleaming palaces of Olympus dim into soft candlelight, and we turn our attention instead to three quiet figures who, the Greeks whispered, held more power than the gods themselves. Welcome to the Fates, weavers of destiny. Picture, if you will, a chamber outside of time, not on Olympus, gleaming with marble and ambrosia, not in the underworld, with its grey rivers and whispering shades. Somewhere older than both, somewhere the gods themselves do not fully command. Here, three sisters sit in eternal, unhurried labor. Their names are Clotho, Lachesis, and Atropos, and between them they hold the entire span of every mortal life that has ever been or ever will be. Clotho, her name simply means the spinner, draws the raw thread of existence from her distaff. With each pull of her fingers, a new life begins. A child draws its first breath. The very instant her thread first takes form, there is something achingly tender in this image, that somewhere, always, a goddess is gently spinning the beginning of someone's story. Even now, even as you listen to this, Lachesis comes next, and her name means the allotter. She measures, she decides, with a calm, almost maternal precision. How long that thread shall run, how many years, how many joys, how many sorrows will be woven into its length. The Greeks believed she used a rod to mark out a person's portion of fate, walking the invisible boundary between a long, rich life and a brief, bright one. Before we continue, if these stories have become part of your nights, consider subscribing to the channel as we prepare another story for you. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the story. And finally, Atropos. Her name means she who cannot be turned. She carries the shears. And when the appointed measure has been spun and allotted, she cuts, cleanly, without malice, without hesitation, without appeal. Not even Zeus, king of all gods, dared stay her hand. This is perhaps the detail that startles people most when they first learn of the Fates, that the king of Olympus, lord of lightning, was not above them. In most tellings, even Zeus deferred to the Moirai. The poet Hesiod, writing in the 8th century BCE in his Theogony, names them as daughters of Nyx, primordial night herself, born before Zeus ever took his throne, elder even to the Olympian order. In other traditions, they are daughters of Zeus and Themis, the goddess of divine law, seated beside the throne of justice itself, as if to say, even law bows to destiny. Picture them as three weathered, ageless women, sometimes young, sometimes old, sometimes one of each, for the Greeks pictured them as standing outside the ordinary river of time that ages mortals. They were not feared the way the monstrous Gorgons were feared, nor adored the way Aphrodite was adored. They inspired something quieter, a hush, a respect bordering on reverence. Mortals built no grand temples ablaze with gold for the Fates. Instead, small shrines, modest altars, quiet offerings, because what, after all, do you offer to the very shape of your life? Their fingerprints are pressed into the deepest stories of Greek myth. It was the Fates who, legend says, could be momentarily charmed, just once, by the wine and music of Dionysus, persuaded to let the hero Admetus escape death if another would die in his place. It was the Fates whose threads even the mighty Achilles could not escape. His glorious, brief life measured out long before he ever lifted a spear at Troy. Some say it was the Fates who attended every divine birth and mortal birth alike, slipping unseen into the room already at work before the first cry had faded. In the chapters ahead, we will walk slowly through their origins, their family, their unimaginable power over gods and mortals alike, and the stories, tender, tragic, and strange, that the Greeks told about the three sisters who held every life in their hands. So let the evening settle around you. Let your thoughts slow to the gentle rhythm of a turning spindle. Somewhere, the thread is already spinning. To understand the fates, we must travel back. Further back than Olympus. Further back than Zeus. Further back even than the gleaming generation of Titans who once ruled the cosmos. We must travel to the very beginning of things, to a darkness that existed before light had a name. The ancient poet Hesiod, composing his Theogony sometime in the 8th century BCE, gives us our earliest surviving account of the universe's architecture. He tells us that in the beginning there was chaos. Not chaos in our modern sense of disorder, but a yawning emptiness, a vast and formless gap. From this gap came Gaia, the earth, broad-bosomed and eternal. And from chaos, too, came Nyx, night herself, dark-robed, swift, and ancient beyond reckoning. Nyx, in Hesiod's telling, was a mother of staggering and often unsettling fertility. Alone, without need of a consort, she brought forth a whole lineage of primordial forces, the raw materials of human experience given divine shape. She bore Thanatos, death, and his gentler twin, Hypnos, sleep. She bore Eris, strife, who would later toss the golden apple that started the Trojan War. She bore Nemesis, retribution, the goddess who ensures that pride and excess are eventually balanced by ruin. And in this same dark nursery, Hesiod tells us, Nyx brought forth the Moirai, the Fates. Let this sink in for a moment, because it tells us something essential about how the Greeks understood destiny itself. The Fates were not created by the Olympian gods. They were not fashioned as servants or tools of Zeus's new order. They came into being before Zeus was even born, sprung from the same ancient darkness that gave the world death and sleep and strife. In this oldest version of the myth, the Moirai are not subordinate to divine kingship. They are older than kingship altogether. They belong to the deep architecture of existence, woven into the universe at a level the Olympian gods could only inherit, never overrule. This is a profound idea, and it's worth sitting with. In a world where gods quarreled, where Zeus overthrew his own father Cronus, where power could be seized through cunning or violence or sheer strength, the Fates remained untouched by all of it. Dynasties of gods could rise and fall. Titans could be cast into Tartarus. A new Olympian order could be built atop the bones of the old. And through it all, the threads kept spinning, the measures kept being taken, the shears kept closing, indifferent to which god currently sat the throne. But Hesiod, ever thorough, gives us a second account as well. And this is part of what makes Greek mythology so endlessly fascinating to wander through. It rarely offers one tidy answer. Instead, it offers layered, sometimes contradictory traditions, each shaped by different poets, different cities, different centuries of retelling. In this second telling, the Moirai are not daughters of night at all, but daughters of Zeus and Themis. Themis was no ordinary goddess. Her name means, roughly, divine law or natural order. She personified the unwritten rules that held both gods and mortals to account, the deep justice beneath the surface of events. She was often depicted holding scales, blindfolded in later artistic traditions, a clear ancestor of the figure we still picture today as Lady Justice. In this version, the Fates take their seat beside their mother and father as part of a carefully ordered household. Hesiod describes them, alongside their sisters the Horai, the seasons, who governed the turning of the year and the rhythms of growth, as honored attendants of Zeus's court, dwelling near the throne of the king of gods. Here, the Moirai are not ancient outsiders to Olympian order. but woven directly into it, daughters of law itself, ensuring that the universe runs not just on raw power, but on measured, lawful consequence. Why does this matter? Because it reveals something the Greeks believed deeply, that fate and justice were, at their root, intertwined concepts. Themis represents the principle that actions have consequences, that the cosmos operates by rule rather than whim. To make the fates her daughters is to suggest that destiny itself is not random cruelty. It is law, applied with perfect, patient consistency to every living thing. Your thread is not cut by accident. It is measured according to a deeper order, one that even Zeus, for all his thunder, must respect. It's worth noting, too, that ancient sources rarely treat these two genealogies as a contradiction needing to be resolved. The Greeks were comfortable holding both truths at once. The Fates as primordial daughters of night, vast and untouchable, predating the gods, and the Fates as daughters of Zeus and Themis, integrated into the very fabric of divine justice. Perhaps both are true in their own way. Perhaps the Fates are old enough to have existed before Zeus, and yet close enough to him now to sit beside his throne, having outlasted every order that came before, and simply taken their place within whichever order currently stands. Some later writers offer still other glimpses. The philosopher Plato, in his great work, The Republic, gives us one of the most haunting images of the Fates in all of Greek literature. In the myth of a story told near the very end of the dialogue, describing a soldier who dies, glimpses the architecture of the afterlife, and returns to tell of it. Plato places the Moirai at the very center of the cosmos itself. He describes a great spindle of necessity, turning at the heart of all creation, with the three sisters seated around it upon thrones, each singing of what was, what is, and what shall be. Lachesis sings of the past, Clotho of the present, Atropos of the future, and souls preparing to be born must choose the pattern of their next life from lots scattered before them, a choice the Fates then ratify, spinning and sealing the soul's chosen destiny into unbreakable thread. Here we see the Moirai elevated to something almost cosmological, not merely household goddesses attending Zeus, not merely primordial sisters born of darkness, but the literal mechanism by which the universe itself turns, woven into its deepest architecture, present at the genesis of every soul that has ever walked beneath the sun. What unites every version, every tradition, every poet's retelling, is this: the Fates are old. Older than memory, older than Olympus, older in some tellings than the very gods who came to rule the sky and sea and underworld. And they are, in nearly every account, untouchable. Not subject to bribery, not subject to seduction, not subject even to the will of kings divine or mortal. Other gods could be flattered with sacrifice, charmed with beauty, outwitted with cleverness. Zeus himself transformed into swans and showers of gold to pursue his desires. But no story tells of the Fates being tricked or seduced or overpowered. They simply continue their work, patient and unhurried, the same quiet rhythm beneath the noise of every divine drama that unfolds around them. In our next segment, we will meet the three sisters individually, Clotho, Lachesis, and Atropos, and look closely at the symbols the Greeks gave them, the spindle, the measuring rod, and the terrible gentle shears. We will explore what each tool meant, and what it told the ancient world about the shape of a human life. For now, simply let the image rest with you, somewhere outside of time, in a darkness older than Olympus. Three sisters were already at their work, before the first star had fully settled into the sky. There is something the Greeks understood instinctively that we sometimes forget in our modern world, with its tidy categories and clean definitions. They understood that the deepest truths about existence are best expressed not through argument, but through image, not through doctrine, but through symbol. And so when they wished to describe the mystery of human destiny, the raw, bewildering fact that we are born, that we live a measured span, and that we die. They did not write a philosophy. They drew three women, each holding a tool, each performing one quiet, endless task. The spindle, the rod, the shears, simple objects. Objects you might find in any household of the ancient Mediterranean world. And yet in the hands of Clotho, Lachesis, and Atropos, they become something else entirely. They become the architecture of every life that has ever been lived. Let us take them one at a time, slowly, the way the sisters themselves work, without hurry, without impatience, with a kind of deep, settled attention. Clotho, she is the first, and her name, as we touched on in the opening, means simply the spinner. But let us linger here longer than we did before, because there is far more to her than the word alone suggests. Clotho's instrument is the distaff and spindle, the ancient tools of thread-making that were, in the Greek world, among the most deeply domestic and deeply feminine of all objects. Nearly every woman in the ancient Mediterranean world knew how to spin. It was not merely a chore. It was a constant rhythmic presence in daily life, something done in the evenings, during conversations, during long quiet afternoons. The act of spinning was so ordinary, so unhurried, so woven into the texture of everyday existence, that it became, for the Greeks, the perfect metaphor for the beginning of life itself. Something simple, something almost unnoticed, and yet indispensable. Clotho draws the thread of life from unspun fiber, from raw, undifferentiated potential, and through the turning of her spindle gives it form, gives it direction, gives it the character it will carry through all the years ahead. Some traditions held that the quality of the thread itself varied, that some lives were spun from fine, gleaming wool, smooth and strong, destined for a long and fortunate run, while others were spun from rougher, more fragile stuff, prone to snapping under strain. Whether this reflected divine intention or simply the deep arbitrariness of fate, the ancient sources do not fully agree, but the image endures that from the very first moment of your existence, someone was already shaping the texture of what your life would be. There is, in depictions of Clotho, often a kind of youthfulness. She is sometimes the youngest of the three sisters, fresh-faced, attentive, her fingers always moving. If you imagine a sound to accompany her work, it is the soft, continuous hum of thread being drawn through practiced fingers, not dramatic, not foreboding, simply present, simply beginning. What strikes us most about Clotho is this: she begins every story. Every hero who ever drew a sword at Troy, every philosopher who ever sat in an Athenian garden, every fisherman who ever pulled nets from the Aegean, every mother who ever held a new child to her chest, all of them began with Clotho. Her hands touched every life that has ever been lived. She is, in the most literal sense imaginable, the mother of all beginnings. Lachesis. She stands in the middle, and her name means the allotter, or she who assigns by lot. If Clotho is concerned with the beginning of a life, Lachesis is concerned with its shape, its particular portion, its allotted measure of days and years and experiences. Her instrument is typically depicted as a rod or staff, sometimes described as a measuring rod, which she uses to determine the length of the thread Clotho has spun. But the rod is more than a ruler. It is a tool of decision. Lachesis does not simply measure what is already fixed. In many traditions, she is the one who actively assigns a soul, its particular share of fate, drawing lots, distributing portions, determining not just how long a life will run, but what quality of destiny will accompany it. Plato's myth of air, which we visited briefly in our last segment, gives Lachesis one of the most extraordinary roles in all of Greek literary tradition. It is she who speaks first to the souls preparing to be reborn. A prophet carries lots and patterns of lives before them, scattering them at the feet of the waiting souls. And Lachesis, in Plato's vision, declares, "The responsibility belongs to the one who chooses, the god, is blameless. These are words that have echoed through centuries of philosophical debate about free will and fate. She is saying, with the serene authority of someone who has heard this argument countless times, you chose your life. We only ratified the choice. The fates did not impose your destiny upon you. They simply honored the shape of who you already were. This nuance is important. In many popular modern understandings of fate, the concept is imagined as a kind of tyranny, a cruel external imposition of outcomes upon helpless mortals. But the Greek tradition was far more subtle than this. Lachesis, the allotter, the measurer, stands precisely at the intersection between what is given and what is chosen. She is neither oppressor nor servant. She is something more like a great, impartial accountant of the soul, tallying up what each life has earned and what it is owed. If Clotho carries the energy of youth, Lachesis often appears in ancient descriptions as the middle-aged sister, measured, experienced, neither impulsive nor exhausted. She surveys, she considers, and then, with the quiet authority of someone who has never once made a mistake, she assigns Atropos. And here we arrive at the third sister, and we must take a slow breath before we do, because she is the most fearsome of the three, not through cruelty, but through certainty. Her name, Atropos, means she who cannot be turned, or the inflexible one. The Romans would call her morta. Her instrument is a pair of shears, sometimes described as bronze scissors or abhorred shears, and her task is the one none of us can escape. When the thread has been spun and its measure has been assigned, Atropos cuts it, cleanly, without warning, without appeal. She is, in many artistic depictions, the eldest of the three. White-haired, still-faced, with an expression not of malice, but of absolute, settled calm. There is no drama in her gesture, no hesitation, no ceremony. The shears close, the thread falls, and somewhere in the mortal world, a life ends. A breath ceases. A pair of eyes closes for the last time. What is most striking about Atropos is precisely what her name declares. She cannot be turned. Not by prayers, not by sacrifice, not by beauty, not by cleverness, not by the tears of those who love you. The other gods of the Greek world could sometimes be softened. Zeus had his favorites. Apollo might grant a reprieve. Hermes could be charmed with wit. But Atropos stands apart from all of this divine negotiation. She is the hard, final edge of the universe, the place where every story, no matter how glorious, must eventually arrive. And yet, and this is the thing the Greeks seem to understand with remarkable grace, her finality was not considered evil. It was considered necessary. The very word they used for her inflexibility carries within it no moral condemnation. She is not cruel. She is complete. She is the one who ensures that every thread is actually finished, that a life does not simply trail off into fraying endlessness, but arrives at a true conclusion. Because without Atropos, what would Clotho's spinning mean? Without an ending, there is no shape. Without a final cut, the thread is only fiber. It is Atropos who transforms a span of living into something with genuine form. A story with no ending is no story at all. Together, the three sisters form something the Greeks rarely articulated directly, but seemed to feel instinctively, a portrait of time itself. Clotho, the beginning. Lachesis, the middle. Atropos, the end. Every life contains all three, and each is meaningless without the other two. The spinner cannot spin forever. The allotter must eventually reach the final measure, and even the most terrifying shears can only cut what has first been lovingly, carefully spun. In the next segment, we will step beyond the sisters themselves and into the stories, the great mythological moments where mortal and divine alike encountered the fates directly and learned, sometimes gently and sometimes devastatingly, what it means to come face to face with the shape of your own destiny. The thread, as always, continues. There is a particular kind of story that appears again and again in Greek mythology, one that never quite loses its power no matter how many times it is told. It is the story of the moment of reckoning, the moment when a mortal, or even a god, finds themselves standing not before a sword or a storm or a monster, but before the quiet, irresistible fact of their own destiny. These are the stories where the fates step out from behind the great tapestry of myth and make themselves felt directly in the lives of those they have always been watching. They are not always visible in these moments. Sometimes the fates move like weather, present, shaping everything, seen by no one. But sometimes, in the oldest and most beautiful of the Greek stories, they are there in the room, attending, deciding, and leaving behind them a stillness that no amount of heroism can quite dispel. Let us walk through some of these encounters slowly, the way you walk through a museum after closing time when there is no one else around, and you can stand before each piece as long as you wish. We begin with the story of Meleager, because it is perhaps the most vivid, most human, and most heartbreaking of all the tales in which the fates appear not as distant cosmic forces, but as literal presences in a mortal room. Meleager was the son of Oeneus, king of Calydon, and his wife Althea. When the child was 7 days old, barely a week into his existence, that thread still fresh from Clotho's fingers, the three Moirai appeared in the room where the infant lay. This detail alone deserves a moment of stillness. The Greeks imagined the fates as attending births, slipping into the room like quiet midwives of destiny, already at their work before the child could focus its new eyes on the world. Clotho spoke first and declared that the boy would be noble and brave. Lachesis confirmed it, a great life, a measured portion of glory. And then Atropos looked at the fire burning in the hearth beside the infant's bed, and she spoke her piece with the particular directness that only she is capable of. The boy, she said, would live exactly as long as the log currently burning in that hearth. No longer. The moment that log was reduced to ash, Meleager's thread would be cut. His mother Althea, hearing this, did what any mother might do if given the terrible gift of knowing precisely what would end her child's life. She snatched the log from the fire immediately. She extinguished it with water, wrapped it carefully, and locked it away in a chest, hidden from flame, hidden from harm. In this one desperate act, she essentially froze the shears of Atropos in mid-air. Holding the log safe meant holding her son safe. And for years it worked. Meleager grew to be everything the first two fates had promised. Bold, celebrated, the hero of the great Caledonian boar hunt, a man admired across Greece. But here is what the myth knows that the mother could not bear to accept. The fates cannot be outmaneuvered. They can only be delayed. Years later, after the boar hunt, a bitter quarrel erupted over the division of the spoils. Meleager killed 2 of his mother's brothers in the heat of the dispute, and Althea, devastated by grief, by fury, by the unbearable collision of her love for her son and her love for her dead brothers, made the most terrible choice in all of Greek mythology. She took the log from the chest, she placed it back in the fire, and she watched it burn. Somewhere across Calydon, Meleager felt the life go out of him. He died without wound or sickness, without sword or arrow, as if some invisible thing that had always been sustaining him was simply, quietly withdrawn. When the log turned to ash, the thread fell. Althea, we are told, could not survive what she had done. She took her own life not long after. What this story carries is not a warning against the fates, but something deeper and stranger, a warning against the illusion of escape. The log in the chest did not save Meleager from his fate. It only changed the shape of how that fate arrived, threading through the hands of the very woman who loved him most. From Calydon we travel to Thessaly and to the story of Admetus and Alcestis, a tale in which the fates are not quite outmaneuvered, but are, in one extraordinary and wine-soaked night, persuaded to be generous. Admetus was a king beloved of the god Apollo, who had served him as a shepherd during a period of divine punishment. In gratitude for Admetus's kindness during that time, Apollo wished to grant his mortal friend a great boon, and went to the Moirai with a request that when the day of Admetus's death arrived, he might be permitted to escape it, if another soul would willingly go to death in his place. The Fates, some sources tell us, were not unmoved by Apollo's appeal, but they were not simply won over by argument either. According to certain traditions, Apollo plied the three sisters with wine, an almost comic detail that humanizes these vast cosmic beings in a way that feels distinctly, beautifully Greek, and softened by Dionysus's gift, or perhaps simply moved by some deeper logic of balance. The Moirai agreed. When the appointed day came, Admetus went to his father, his mother, his friends, asking which among them would die in his place. One by one, they declined. It was his young wife Alcestis, deeply in love, quietly courageous, who agreed to go. She walked willingly into death so that her husband might live. What follows is a story of rescue. Heracles arriving at the house of mourning, wrestling death himself at the tomb and winning Alcestis back. But what strikes us here is the moment before the rescue, the moment of the agreement, struck in some quiet room between a god who loved a mortal and three sisters who agreed, just once, to let the scales tip a different way. Even in their flexibility, notice what the fates required. They did not cancel the debt. They did not erase the death. They simply allowed it to be transferred, willingly, by another soul. Balance was maintained. The thread that ended was simply a different thread. The Moirai gave an inch, and even that inch cost someone everything. No gathering of fate stories could proceed without pausing, at length, on the most famous of all their mythological shadows, the life and death of Achilles. Achilles was never told his fate by the fates directly. He did not see them in a room at his birth, holding a log above his hearth. But he knew, and this is the aching center of his entire story, because his mother Thetis, the sea nymph, had been told. The thread of Achilles, Clotho had spun short and radiant, a brief life, but a glorious one. A long life, quiet and forgotten, was the alternative. He was never given both. What makes this story so enduring is that Achilles himself eventually chose the short thread, not blindly, not in ignorance, but with open eyes, having been given every chance to step away. He could have stayed home. He could have refused Troy. When Odysseus came to find him at Syros, where his mother had hidden him disguised among women, he could have simply stayed hidden. But something in him reached for the gleaming life rather than the long one. He chose Clotho's bright, brief thread over Lachesis' measured, modest one. This is precisely the idea that Plato's Lachesis articulated. The god is blameless. The responsibility belongs to the one who chooses. The fates did not drive Achilles to Troy. They simply held out both options, and he took the one that burned more brightly, and he burned beautifully and briefly, and was gone before the war was even over. The greatest of the Greek heroes, cut down not by a mighty warrior in open combat, but by an arrow guided by Apollo to the one vulnerable place his mother's protective hand had not quite covered. The thread, as Atropos always intended, fell. These stories, Meleager, Admetus, Achilles, are not three different myths. They are three variations on the same profound, quiet truth, that the fates do not arrive as enemies. They arrive as the shape of what was always going to be true. They are not there to punish or to reward. They are there because every thread, no matter how it is spun, must eventually have a measure, and every measure must eventually find its end. In the next segment, we will rise above the individual stories and look at the fates in their fullest cosmic context, how the Greeks placed them within the larger architecture of the universe, alongside the gods of necessity and night. And what this tells us about how an entire civilization made peace with the things it could not control. The sisters are still at their work. They always are. There is a question that every civilization in every era has eventually had to sit down with and face. It arrives quietly, usually in the dark hours, when the noise of ordinary life has finally settled, and there is nothing left to distract the mind from what it actually knows. The question is this: how much of what happens to us is within our control? And what do we do? How do we live? How do we love? How do we get out of bed in the morning? With the portion that is not. The Greeks did not flinch from this question. They did not paper over it with easy comfort or convenient doctrine. Instead, they built an entire cosmological architecture around it, a vast, layered universe populated with forces and beings and principles that collectively mapped the relationship between freedom and necessity with a precision that philosophers are still studying today. And at the structural center of that architecture, older than most of the gods and answerable to almost none of them, sat the Moirai. To understand the true scale of the Fates' position in the Greek cosmos, we cannot look at them in isolation. We must look at the company they kept. We must look at the great web of primordial forces the Greeks placed alongside them, because together these beings form something remarkable, not just a mythology, but a complete and deeply considered portrait of how the universe actually runs. Begin with Ananke, whose name means, with breathtaking directness, necessity. Ananke is among the oldest beings in the Greek cosmos, a primordial force so vast and so fundamental that she does not require temples or myths or stories in the way that Athena or Poseidon do. She simply is. She is compulsion. She is the principle that certain things cannot be otherwise. That if you drop a stone, it falls. That if a mortal is born, they will die. That cause produces effect with the cold, patient regularity of a law that precedes all lawgivers. In Plato's cosmology, Ananke is described as the mother of the Moirai themselves, or at the very least, as the great spindle around which the cosmos turns, with the Fates seated at its base, perpetually at their work. This is not a casual detail. Plato is telling us something architectural, that the Fates are not arbitrary, not willful, not capricious. They are the daughters of necessity itself. Their decisions are not decisions in the way we might make decisions, weighing options, feeling preferences, choosing between possibilities. Their work is the expression of what simply must be. Clotho does not choose to spin your thread. She spins it because Ananke requires it. Lachesis does not decide your measure. She reads it from a deeper law that she did not write. Atropos does not cut because she wishes to. She cuts because the universe, at its most foundational level, has already determined that the cut must come. This is a philosophy of remarkable sophistication. The Greeks were not saying that destiny is cruel. They were saying that destiny is structural, that it belongs to the same order of things as mathematics, as gravity, as the turning of seasons. You do not rage at winter for arriving. You do not curse the tide for going out. And the Fates, in this understanding, are simply the most intimate expression of that same impersonal, universal constancy, applied to the span of a single human life. Alongside Ananke, we must consider Themis, who we encountered briefly in our discussion of the Fates' parentage, but who deserves a longer pause here, because her relationship with the Moirai illuminates something essential about how the Greeks connected fate with justice. Themis, as we noted, was the goddess of divine law and natural order, not the written laws of human cities, but the deeper, older law that underpins those cities, the law that says oaths must be honored, that hospitality must be observed, that the proper order of things must be maintained, or the universe itself becomes unstable. She was one of the original Titans, one of the first beings to emerge after the primordial gods, and she was revered not as a distant abstraction, but as a living presence at the heart of the divine order. When later traditions made the Moirai daughters of Zeus and Themis, they were fusing two great ideas into a single family, fate and justice. They were saying that what happens to you is not merely the result of blind necessity. It is also, in some deeper sense, what you were owed, that the length of your thread and the texture of your days reflects a cosmic accounting that is lawful at its core. This does not mean that every short thread is a punishment or every long one a reward. It means something subtler, that the universe is not indifferent, that there is a principle, older than the gods and binding upon them, which ensures that everything is balanced, that every account is eventually settled, that Lachesis' rod measures truly. This is why the Fates were never depicted as enemies of justice. They were considered its deepest expression. The mortal who lived well and died young had not been cheated by the Fates. The mortal who lived badly and died old had not escaped them. In the larger ledger that Themis kept, all things were ultimately in order, even when they appeared, from inside a single brief human life, to be devastatingly otherwise. We must also consider the Fates in relation to Zeus himself, because this relationship is one of the most philosophically fascinating tensions in all of Greek mythology, and ancient writers return to it repeatedly without ever quite resolving it, perhaps because they understood instinctively that it was not meant to be resolved. On one hand, Zeus is the king of the gods, the lord of Olympus, the wielder of thunder, the father of gods and mortals. His authority is the organizing principle of the current cosmic order. When he speaks, creation listens. On the other hand, and this was never quite a comfortable fact for the poets to handle, he does not appear to stand above the Fates. In Homer's Iliad, there is a moment of excruciating tension in which Zeus looks down at the battlefield below Troy and sees his own son, Sarpedon, approaching the moment of his death. The father of the gods, the most powerful being in the cosmos, weighs in his golden scales the fate of his beloved child, and the scale tips toward death. And Zeus, for all his power, grieves. He weeps, and he lets it happen. The goddess Hera speaks plainly to him in that moment. If he rescues Sarpedon from his appointed fate, he will unravel something in the cosmic order itself, set a precedent that every god will wish to follow, and the great fabric of destiny will begin to fray. Zeus accepts this. He mourns, and he does not intervene. Even the king of gods, in the end, does not place himself above the sisters and their thread. This is the Greek cosmos in its truest form, not a simple hierarchy with one all-powerful being at the top, but a web of overlapping authorities and ancient constraints, in which power and necessity exist in a kind of permanent, productive tension. Zeus rules, but he rules within the framework the Fates maintain. He is not their servant, but he is not their master either. He is, in some sense, their colleague, the force that governs the present moment, working alongside forces that govern the entire span of time. Sitting just beside this relationship is a concept the Greeks called Moira in its singular form. Fate, not as three women with tools, but as an abstract, impersonal portion. Every mortal was understood to have their Moira, their share, their allotted part. Not just their lifespan, but their station, their character, their place in the great web of things. To act within your Moira was to live rightly, in accordance with what you were, to reach beyond it. This was hubris, the most dangerous of Greek sins, the overstepping that inevitably attracted the attention of Nemesis, and the eventual correction of the cosmic order. The three Moirai and the concept of Moira were not precisely the same thing, but they were deeply related, two ways of expressing the same underlying Greek conviction that existence is inherently proportional, that everything has its proper measure, and that the gravest human error is to refuse to accept yours. This is what makes the Greek relationship with fate so different from simple fatalism. Fatalism, as we tend to use the word, suggests passivity. If everything is already determined, why act at all? But the Greeks did not read the fates that way. The existence of the Moirai did not prevent Achilles from being glorious, did not prevent Admetus from being loved, did not prevent ordinary mortals from living with full-throated engagement in every day they were allotted. The thread is going to run its length. The question is what you weave into it while it does. In our next segment, we will trace how the fates traveled beyond Greece, into Rome, into the Norse world, into the early modern imagination, and explore how this idea of three women tending the thread of life proved so resilient, so deeply human, that it could not be contained within a single culture or a single century. Because some ideas, it turns out, have very long threads. There is a particular kind of idea that refuses to stay inside the borders of the culture that first gave it shape. It crosses mountains and sea lanes and centuries with the ease of a traveler who has no particular attachment to any one country because it belongs in some essential way to all of them. The idea of three women tending the thread of human life is exactly such an idea. It did not remain Greek. It did not remain ancient. It moved, carried in the minds of soldiers and merchants and poets and priests, across the breadth of the known world and into cultures that had never heard the name Olympus. And in each new place it arrived, it found a home waiting for it, as though the people there had always known it was coming. This is one of the most quietly astonishing things about the Moirai, not just what they meant to the Greeks, but how completely the rest of the world agreed with them. The first and most direct inheritors of the fates were the Romans, and the transfer of power was, as Roman cultural borrowing so often was, conducted with great efficiency and very little sentimentality about origins. The Romans called them the Parcae, 3 women, 3 tools, 3 functions. The framework was lifted almost intact from the Greek tradition and set down within Roman religious practice with only modest adjustment. Their individual names changed. Clotho became Nona, whose name refers to the 9th month of pregnancy, the month of birth, the moment of arrival. Lachesis became Decima, the 10th, the full term, the measure completed, and Atropos became Morta, whose name needs no translation because it carries within it the same root that gives us the words mortal, mortality, and murder. The Romans, characteristically, name their death goddess with a directness that left nothing to the imagination. What is interesting about the Roman Parcae is not so much how they differed from the Greek Moirai, but how completely the Roman world absorbed their significance. The Romans were, in general, a culture that prized order, law, and the proper functioning of structured systems, virtues that aligned naturally with the fates' impartial, lawful work. The Parcae fit seamlessly into a Roman worldview that already valued the idea that the universe operated according to fixed, rational principles. Roman Stoic philosophy, which flourished from roughly the 3rd century BCE onward and produced some of the ancient world's greatest minds, Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, was built in large part on the acceptance of exactly what the Parcae represented, that there are things beyond your control, that the proper response to this fact is not despair but equanimity, and that the only domain of true freedom available to a mortal is the domain of true freedom available to a mortal is the domain of their own will and character. Marcus Aurelius, writing his private meditations in the 2nd century CE, never once names the Parcae directly, but he might as well have. Every page of the meditations breathes the same air that the fates inhabit. The deep, settled acceptance that your portion is your portion, that it was assigned by forces larger than yourself, and that the wisest and most dignified thing you can do is live it fully, without complaint, without grasping for what was never yours to hold. The Roman fates did not merely persist as religious figures, they became a philosophical posture, a way of meeting the world. But the Romans were not the only people spinning their own version of this story. Far to the north, In the cold and fog-wrapped world of the Germanic and Norse peoples, an almost identical trinity was taking shape, and doing so, as far as scholars can determine, independently of any direct Greek or Roman influence. The Norse called them the Norns. Their names were Urtha, Berthandi, and Skuld, and if you listen to what these names mean, you will feel an immediate and eerie recognition. Urtha relates to what has become, the past, what has already been woven into the fabric of things. Berthandi speaks to what is becoming, the present moment in its unfolding. And Skuld, whose name carries within it the same ancestral root as the English word shall, represents what shall be, the future already implicit in the present, the thread already being drawn from the spindle. The Norns did not live on some distant Olympus or in a chamber outside time. Norse mythology placed them at the base of Yggdrasil, the great ash tree whose roots and branches encompassed all the 9 worlds of Norse cosmology. They lived beside the well of Urtha, a sacred spring from which they drew water to pour over the roots of Yggdrasil each day, keeping the great tree alive. And each day they carved the fates of gods and men into the trunk of that tree, inscribing destiny into the living wood of the universe itself. The parallels with the Moirai are so precise and so complete that scholars of comparative mythology have long suspected they share a common ancestor. Some even older Indo-European tradition of fate goddesses that predates both Greek and Norse cultures, carried in the deep memory of Proto-Indo-European peoples as they spread across the continent thousands of years before Homer or the Eddas were ever composed. If this is true, and the linguistic evidence is genuinely compelling, then the Moirai and the Norns are not cousins by adoption but sisters by blood, 2 branches of the same impossibly ancient root. What strikes us about the Norse version is its particular texture of intimacy. The Norns carve fate into a tree. They water the roots of the world daily. They are not distant, abstract cosmic forces. They are tenders, gardeners of destiny, in a sense, keeping the great structure of the universe alive through patient, daily labor. There is something in this that feels Norse in its very bones, a culture forged in harsh winters and relentless northern seas, understood instinctively that the world does not sustain itself, that the fabric of existence requires constant, unglamorous maintenance by those willing to show up and do the quiet work. The Norns also wove, and critically, they wove not just the fates of ordinary mortals, but the fates of the gods themselves, including Odin, the Allfather, the most powerful being in the Norse cosmos. Just as Zeus could not override the Moirai, Odin could not escape the Norns. The doom of the gods, Ragnarok, the great final battle at the end of the world, had already been woven into Yggdrasil long before any god drew breath. The Norns knew. They had always known. They simply kept watering the tree. Beyond Greece, Rome, and the Norse world, the image of fate weavers spread in more diffuse but no less fascinating directions. In Slavic mythology, 3 fate goddesses known as the Sudis or Rojenici attended every birth, determining the course of the newborn's life in terms strikingly similar to the Moirai's attendance at Meleager's cradle. In Baltic traditions, fate goddesses spun and wove the garments of life. In the ancient Near East, the Mesopotamian concept of the tablets of destiny, divine inscriptions that determined the fates of gods and humans alike, gestures toward the same deep conviction that destiny has a texture, a material form, something that can be written or woven or inscribed, something that exists as a real object in the architecture of the cosmos. Even within the Abrahamic traditions that would eventually reshape the intellectual world of Europe, echoes persisted. The Hebrew concept of the Book of Life, in which every soul's name is written and each year's fate inscribed on the high holy days, carries unmistakable resonance with the fate's great ledger. The image of God as a weaver appears multiple times in the Psalms, and in the book of Job, the thread was never entirely cut. It simply traveled, woven into the fabric of new traditions, surfacing in new forms wherever human beings sat down long enough to ask the question that the fates have always been the answer to. In the early modern world, the fates resurfaced with remarkable vigor. Shakespeare, who drew from classical tradition with voracious appetite, populated his plays with their shadows. The three witches of Macbeth, who appear at a crossroads, speak in prophecy, determine the arc of a great man's destruction, and cannot be turned aside, are among the most recognizable descendants of the Moirai in all of English literature. Shakespeare never names them as the Fates, but he did not need to. Every audience that had ever read Hesiod or Ovid knew exactly what those three figures represented the moment they appeared on the blasted heath. The Renaissance artists reached for the Moirai again and again, painting them, sculpting them, embedding them in the allegorical programs of great halls and private chapels, because the educated European mind of the 15th and 16th centuries had been so thoroughly formed by classical learning that the three sisters felt not like foreign mythology, but like old familiar truths. What all of this tells us: the Romans, the Norse, the Slavs, the Mesopotamians, Shakespeare's Scotland, is something the Greeks perhaps understood first, but did not invent alone. That the image of three figures tending the thread of life speaks to something so deep in human consciousness that no single culture can claim it or exhaust it. We need the fates, it seems. We need to believe that the span of a life has a shape, that it is not random noise but a thread with a beginning, a measure, and a final cut. We need to believe that someone, somewhere, is paying attention. In our final segment, we will return to where we began, to that quiet chamber, to the sound of thread through fingers, to the three sisters at their eternal work, and ask what the fates might still have to teach us, here, now, in a world that has largely stopped building shrines to them, but has never quite stopped needing them. The thread is almost at its measure, but not quite yet. We have traveled a long way together in this documentary. We have sat with Hesiod in the 8th century BCE as he reached back into the darkness before Olympus and found three sisters already at their work. We have watched Althea pull a burning log from a fire and believe, with the fierce love of a mother, that she had outmaneuvered eternity. We have stood with Zeus over the battlefield at Troy as he wept for a son he could not save. We have traced the thread as it crossed the Alps and entered Rome, rowed the longships north into the Norse world, pressed itself into the bark of Yggdrasil, surfaced in Shakespeare's fog, and whispered through the allegories of Renaissance painters who had never seen Greece, but carried Greece inside them nonetheless. And now we arrive here, at the final measure, at the place where Lachesis sets down her rod. The question that remains, the question that every great documentary about the ancient world must eventually face with honesty, is not simply what the fates meant to people who are gone. It is what they mean to us now, in the particular noise and brightness of the world we actually inhabit. We live, most of us, in a culture that has a complicated and restless relationship with the idea of things being beyond our control. We are surrounded, every waking hour, by the promise of optimization, that the right diet, the right routine, the right mindset, the right technology, the right choices made early and consistently enough will produce the outcomes we desire. We have built an entire civilization on the premise that the thread can be lengthened, strengthened, made more resilient through sufficient ingenuity and effort, and in many ways this has served us extraordinarily well. We live longer than any generation before us. We have pushed back diseases that once cut whole populations short, moved Atropos's shears back by decades through medicine and sanitation and accumulated knowledge. And yet, the shears are still there. They have always been there. And if you live long enough, or love deeply enough, or pay attention closely enough to the world around you, you will feel their presence. in the hospital room, in the phone call that comes at an unexpected hour, in the quiet moment when a doctor's expression shifts before the words do. In these moments, all the optimization in the world falls silent, and something much older than modernity makes itself felt. This is precisely where the fates remain, not as relics, but as living teachers. The first thing the Moirai teach us, have always taught us, across every culture that has ever told their story, is the strange, counterintuitive peace that can come from acceptance, not resignation, not passivity, not the defeated shrug of someone who has given up, but the deep, grounded acceptance of a person who has looked clearly at what is real and chosen to live within it rather than against it. The Stoics understood this. Marcus Aurelius, sitting in a military tent on the Danube frontier, ruling the largest empire the Western world had ever seen, wrote to himself in the dark, "Confine yourself to the present, not because the future does not matter, but because the future belongs to Ananke, to necessity, to the Moirai, and the only thread you can actually weave is the one you are holding right now, in this moment, with this breath." The fates do not ask us to be indifferent to our lives, they ask us to be honest about them, to hold them with open hands rather than clenched fists, to understand that the measure of a life is not its length, but the quality of attention brought to every portion of it, however long or brief that portion turns out to be. The second thing they teach us is something about the dignity of limits. We are a culture deeply uncomfortable with limits. We treat them as failures, as temporary obstacles to be engineered around, as evidence that we have not yet tried hard enough or thought cleverly enough. But the Greek tradition, in its profound and hard-won wisdom, understood something different, that limits are not the enemies of meaning. They are the precondition of it. Clotho's thread is beautiful precisely because it is a thread and not an ocean. A story is only a story because it has a beginning and an end. Remove either, and you have not created something more meaningful, only something formless. Atropos' shears, terrible as they are also the instrument that gives a life its final shape, that transforms a span of living into something with genuine contour, genuine consequence, genuine weight. The fates in this reading are not our adversaries, they are our editors. And every writer knows that the most important thing an editor does is not add, but cut, with precision, with necessity, with the cleanness that transforms a wandering draft into something true. And the third thing, perhaps the quietest and the most enduring of all, the fates teach us that we are not alone in the universe's attention. This may sound strange coming from three figures who do not intervene, who do not rescue, who do not soften the blow in any conventional sense. But consider what their very existence implies. Every life, no matter how small, no matter how brief, no matter how obscure, has a thread, has been spun, measured, and will be gathered in. The fisherman on the Aegean with no name in any history book had his thread. The child who lived only 7 days had her thread. The soldier who fell at Marathon with no one watching had his thread. No life slips through unnoticed. No life is too insignificant for Clotho's fingers, too brief for Lachesis' rod, too quiet for Atropos' attention. In a universe this vast, this indifferent in so many of its operations to the presence of a single mortal life, this is not a small comfort. It is, in its own way, an enormous one. As we bring this documentary to its close, we turn one last time to that chamber outside of time. The light is the same as it always was, neither bright nor dark, simply present. The sound is the same, thread sliding through fingers, the soft turning of a spindle. The sisters at their work, unhurried, as they have always been, as they will always be. Clotho draws the thread, new lives beginning even now, in this moment, somewhere in the world, a first breath taken, and a new story set in motion. Lachesis measures, the rod, moving along the thread with patient, certain hands, reading a length that was always already written into the deeper law of things. And Atropos waits, as she always waits, not impatiently, not cruelly, but with the settled stillness of someone who knows that her moment always comes, and that when it does, it will be exactly right.